The sound cracked across the garden before anyone understood what had happened. Evangeline's head turned sharply to the side, her hand flying to her cheek, and for one long moment, the entire party stood frozen, teacups halfway to lips, laughter dying in throats. Lady Constance stood before her, chest rising and falling, her gloved hand still raised in the afternoon light as if she meant to strike again. No one moved. The string quartet near the fountain stopped playing mid-note. Somewhere behind the roses, a plate slipped from someone's fingers and shattered on the stone path. But even that sound seemed distant, swallowed by the silence that had fallen over Lord Carrington's famous garden party. Evangeline did not cry out. She had learned long ago that crying out only made things worse. She simply stood there, her cheek burning, her eyes wide with a shock that went far deeper than the sting on her skin. She had known her stepmother's temper for years, had felt the sharp edges of her words more times than she could count, but never, not once, had Constance done something like this in front of witnesses, never in front of the entire county. "You dare correct me," Constance hissed, low enough that only those nearest could hear, though her voice still carried in the stunned quiet. "You dare speak of your father's wishes as though you understood anything about this family." Evangeline's lips parted, but no words came. Her mind was racing, trying to understand how such an ordinary afternoon had turned so quickly into something she would remember for the rest of her life. It had started with nothing at all. A guest, an older gentleman with kind eyes, had asked her a simple question about the Ashworth estate, about whether the orchards her father had planted were still being tended the way he had wanted. Evangeline had answered honestly. She always answered honestly. She had said that her father had wanted the eastern fields to remain untouched, given as they were to the tenant families who worked them, and that she hoped that tradition would continue. It was such a small thing to say, a true thing, but Constance had heard it as a challenge, as an accusation whispered before witnesses that she had failed to honor her late husband's wishes, that she had perhaps done worse than fail them, and in front of the very people whose opinion she guarded most carefully, in front of ladies who wrote letters to other ladies about every small thing they witnessed, Constance had lost the composure she wore so carefully, every single day. Evangeline's stepsisters, Charlotte and Beatrice, stood a few feet away, and for once neither of them wore their usual smirks. Charlotte's face had gone pale, her fan frozen halfway to her chest. Beatrice simply stared, her mouth slightly open, as though she too could not quite believe what her mother had just done. The silence stretched on. Evangeline could feel dozens of eyes on her, could feel the weight of every unspoken judgment settling onto her shoulders. She knew what they were all thinking. Poor girl. How shameful. What a scene. And beneath those thoughts, she knew, ran a colder current, one that whispered that perhaps she had deserved it, that a proper young lady would never provoke her guardian so, that there must be some truth to whatever unkind things had been said about her over the years in drawing rooms she never entered. She took a small step back, her only instinct now to remove herself before the moment stretched any further, before Constance found more words to fling at her, more reasons to make the scene worse. But before she could turn, before she could retreat toward the hedges and disappear from the garden entirely, a hand closed gently but firmly around her wrist. It was not Constance's hand. Constance's hand was still raised, still trembling with the aftermath of what she had done. This hand was larger, warmer, and it did not grip her the way a punishment would. It steadied her instead, the way one might catch a glass before it tipped from a table. Evangeline turned, startled, and found herself looking up into the face of a man she recognized only vaguely from introductions earlier that afternoon. Nathaniel Ashford, the Duke of Foxmere. She remembered Lord Carrington presenting him to the assembled guests with no small amount of pride, remembered the way every unmarried lady at the party had straightened her posture the moment his name was spoken. She had exchanged only the briefest of pleasantries with him before the afternoon had turned toward disaster, a polite nod, a few words about the weather, nothing more. And yet here he was, his hand around her wrist, his eyes fixed not on her, but on Lady Constance, and there was something in his expression that made even the birds in the nearby trees seem to fall quiet. "I believe," he said, his voice calm but carrying clearly across the stunned garden, "that you have made a grave error, madam." Constance's raised hand finally lowered. Her face, which had been flushed with fury only a moment before, drained of color, as she registered who exactly had stepped between her and her stepdaughter. She opened her mouth, likely to offer some explanation, some justification dressed up in polite words. But the Duke did not give her the chance. "I have attended many garden parties in my life," he continued, his tone even, almost conversational, though every word landed like a stone dropped into still water. "I have witnessed disagreements, disappointments, even the occasional heated word exchanged between family members who forget themselves in the heat of the moment, but I have never, in all my years, seen a woman strike a young lady of her own household before an assembly of guests, as though she were disciplining a child, rather than addressing a grown woman of good character." "Your Grace," Constance began, her voice noticeably higher than before, "you misunderstand the situation entirely. My stepdaughter has always been difficult, always eager to embarrass this family in front of others, and I assure you that what you witnessed was a momentary lapse brought on by years of provocation." "I saw no provocation," the Duke said simply. "I saw a young woman answer a question honestly, and I saw you respond in a manner unbecoming of your station and unworthy of the guests you invited here today." A murmur rippled through the crowd, quiet but unmistakable. Evangeline felt her cheeks grow warm again, not from pain this time, but from the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being defended. No one had ever spoken up for her like this before, certainly not in front of so many people, not with such calm and unwavering authority. She glanced at the Duke's hand, still gently circling her wrist, and realized he had not let go since he first caught her arm. It was not an improper hold, nothing that could be mistaken for anything untoward, but it was steady, grounding, as though he understood without being told that she needed something solid to hold on to in that moment. "Lady Constance," the Duke continued, releasing Evangeline's wrist at last, but keeping his gaze fixed on her stepmother, "I would ask that you consider carefully how you wish this afternoon to be remembered. Every person in this garden witnessed what occurred. Every person here will carry the memory of it into their own homes, their own correspondence, their own conversations at dinner tables across the county. I would not wish, if I were you, to add to that memory by continuing in this manner." Constance's jaw tightened. For a woman who had spent years cultivating an image of grace and propriety, who had worked tirelessly to secure her place among the finest families in the region, the Duke's words landed with the force of a verdict already delivered. She glanced around at the gathered guests, at the widened eyes and half-hidden whispers, and Evangeline could see the exact moment her stepmother understood the scope of what she had done. "I merely wished to correct my stepdaughter's behavior," Constance said, her voice softer now, almost pleading, though the plea was clearly directed more at the watching crowd than at the Duke himself. "A mother must sometimes be firm." "A mother, perhaps," the Duke replied. "But you are her stepmother, and even a stepmother owes her charge the basic dignity due to any member of a household. I have known families where affection between such relations grows deep and genuine. I have also, unfortunately, known families where it does not. I will leave it to you to consider which sort of family you wish the county to believe yours to be." Evangeline watched her stepmother search for a response and find none. For the first time in longer than Evangeline could remember, Constance looked genuinely at a loss, her careful composure shattered not by grief or by loss, but by the simple, undeniable fact that she had been witnessed doing something cruel, and that the witness who mattered most in that moment happened to hold more influence than any other person present. Lord Carrington, their host, finally stepped forward from where he had been standing frozen near the refreshment table, his expression a careful mixture of concern and diplomatic urgency. "Perhaps," he said gently, "we might all retire to the shade for a moment. The afternoon grows warm, and I believe cool drinks would do us all some good." It was a graceful attempt to diffuse the moment, and several guests seized upon it gratefully, murmuring their agreement and beginning to drift toward the pergola at the far end of the garden, where servants were already pouring lemonade into crystal glasses. But Evangeline noticed that many eyes still lingered on her and on Constance, and she understood that no amount of cool drinks would erase what had just happened. She turned to thank the Duke, though she barely knew what words to use, for such an unexpected act of kindness from a stranger. But before she could speak, Constance's voice cut through the moment once more, quieter now, aimed only at Evangeline. "We will discuss this at home," she said, her tone icy despite its softness. "You have embarrassed this family enough for one afternoon." Evangeline felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the old fear that had lived there for years, ever since her father's passing had left her in Constance's care. But something had shifted in the last few minutes. She was no longer entirely alone in that fear. Someone else had seen, someone else knew, now, exactly what kind of household she lived in, even if he understood only a fraction of the whole truth. "Lady Constance," the Duke said, before Evangeline could respond, "perhaps it would be wise to allow your stepdaughter a moment to recover before any further discussion takes place. I am certain the other guests would appreciate a return to more pleasant conversation, and I would not wish for this unfortunate incident to overshadow the rest of Lord Carrington's lovely afternoon." There was something in the way he said it, polite on the surface but unmistakably firm beneath, that made Constance's mouth press into a thin line. She gave a stiff nod, the barest incline of her head, and turned to gather her daughters, ushering Charlotte and Beatrice toward the pergola with a hand at each of their backs, as though physically steering them away from any further scrutiny. Evangeline remained standing near the rose hedge, her cheek still warm, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with pain, and everything to do with the strange new reality unfolding around her. The Duke studied her for a moment, his expression softening from the cold authority he had shown Constance into something gentler, more careful. "Are you injured?" he asked quietly. "No," Evangeline said, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Only surprised, Your Grace. She has never done such a thing before others." "Has she done it before? In private?" the Duke asked, his question direct but not unkind. Evangeline hesitated. Years of careful silence rose up in her, the instinct to protect the family name, even when the family had given her little reason to protect anything of theirs. But something about the steadiness in his gaze, the way he had stepped forward without hesitation when no one else in that entire garden had dared to move, made her want to answer honestly. "There have been difficult moments," she said carefully, choosing her words the way she always did, weighing each one before letting it pass her lips. "My stepmother has strong opinions about how a household should be run, and I have not always agreed with them." The Duke seemed to understand that she was saying far less than she knew, and far less than perhaps she wished to say, but he did not press her. Instead, he glanced toward the pergola, where Constance stood with her daughters, speaking in low, urgent tones to a small cluster of guests who had drawn near, likely already attempting to shape the story that would spread through the county by morning. "I should not keep you standing here," the Duke said, "but I would ask, if you are willing, that you allow me to walk with you toward the refreshments. I suspect the sooner you are seen moving calmly among the other guests, the sooner this afternoon's unpleasantness will lose its sharpest edges." Evangeline looked up at him, searching his face for some hidden motive, some reason a duke would trouble himself over the discomfort of a stepdaughter, with no great fortune, and no particular standing of her own. But she found nothing there except what appeared to be genuine concern, the kind she had not encountered from anyone outside her own small circle of servants and tenant families in a very long time.
"Thank you, Your Grace,"
she said finally.
"I would be glad of the company."
They began to walk together across the lawn, and Evangeline was acutely aware of every eye that followed their progress, of every whispered comment exchanged behind raised fans and cupped hands. She had expected to feel humiliated under such scrutiny, and part of her did, the old habit of shame rising hot in her chest. But walking beside the Duke, she found that the stares felt different than they once might have. They no longer seemed aimed solely at her shame. Some of them, she realized with quiet surprise, seemed aimed at curiosity about him, about why a man of his standing had chosen to intervene so publicly on behalf of a young woman most of society barely noticed. As they approached the pergola, Lord Carrington met them with visible relief, quickly directing a servant to bring 2 glasses of lemonade. "Lady Evangeline," he said warmly, clearly attempting to smooth over the tension still hanging in the air, "I do hope you will forgive the disruption. It was never my intention that any guest should feel unwelcome in my garden." "You have nothing to apologize for, my lord," Evangeline replied, accepting the offered glass with a small, grateful smile. "The fault was not yours." Nearby, Charlotte watched the exchange with an expression Evangeline could not quite read, somewhere between resentment and reluctant curiosity. Beatrice, always the softer of the 2 stepsisters, glanced at Evangeline with something almost like sympathy, before quickly looking away, as though afraid her mother might notice. Constance herself stood a short distance away, engaged in conversation, with 2 older women, whose expressions suggested they were listening far more carefully than they were speaking. Evangeline caught fragments of her stepmother's voice. Something about a difficult day, a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. The trials of raising a stepdaughter with such a stubborn nature. It was, Evangeline realized, exactly the kind of story Constance always told, the version of events that painted her as patient and long-suffering, while quietly reshaping Evangeline into the difficult one, the ungrateful one, the cause of every unpleasantness in their household. For years, Evangeline had let those stories stand uncontested, too tired, or too afraid, to argue against them. But today, for the first time, she noticed something different in the faces of the two women, listening to Constance. A flicker of doubt, a glance exchanged between them that suggested they, too, had witnessed the strike in the garden and were finding it difficult to reconcile it with the sympathetic portrait Constance was now painting of herself. The Duke, standing beside Evangeline, seemed to notice it as well. "Word travels quickly in circles such as these," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "Whatever your stepmother says now will matter far less than what 100 witnesses saw with their own eyes." Evangeline looked at him, uncertain how to respond to such directness from a man she had known for less than an hour. "You speak as though you have some experience with such matters, Your Grace." A faint, almost rueful smile touched his lips. "I have spent enough years among society to understand how quickly reputations rise and fall, and how rarely the truth has anything to do with either. I did not step forward today because I enjoy scenes, Lady Evangeline. I stepped forward because what I witnessed was wrong, and I do not believe in remaining silent when something wrong occurs before me, regardless of who commits it." There was a quiet conviction in his voice that struck her more deeply than she expected. She had grown so accustomed to silence, to swallowing her own feelings for the sake of peace within the household, that hearing someone speak so plainly about right and wrong felt almost foreign, like a language she had once known but had nearly forgotten. The afternoon continued around them, guests slowly returning to their conversations, their games of croquet, their leisurely strolls along the garden paths, though an undercurrent of tension remained, a subtle awareness that something significant had shifted that day, even if no one could yet say exactly what. Evangeline sipped her lemonade and watched her stepmother from across the lawn, noting the tightness in Constance's shoulders, the too bright smile she wore, as she moved from group to group, working to repair whatever damage had been done to her standing. For years, Evangeline had believed herself powerless against that carefully maintained image, unable to challenge a version of events that painted her stepmother as patient and herself as difficult. But something had changed today. Someone had seen. Someone with influence, someone whose word carried weight in circles Constance desperately wished to remain part of, had witnessed the truth firsthand and had refused to look away. She did not yet know what it would mean, this unexpected intervention from a duke she had barely spoken to before this afternoon. She did not know whether his concern would extend beyond a single garden party, whether he would remember her name by the following week, or forget her entirely once the season's gossip moved on to some fresher scandal. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Evangeline felt something she had almost forgotten how to recognize: hope. As the afternoon light began to soften into the golden hues of early evening, and the garden party slowly wound toward its close, Evangeline found herself glancing again and again toward the Duke, who remained nearby, engaged now in polite conversation with Lord Carrington, but occasionally sparing her a brief, reassuring glance, as though silently confirming that she was still well, still safe, still standing. She did not know it yet, but the events of that single afternoon, the sharp sting across her cheek and the firm, steadying grip around her wrist that followed it, had already set in motion a chain of events that would change the course of her life entirely. The whispers that would travel through drawing rooms by morning would carry her name farther than it had ever traveled before, and among those whispers, one truth would remain unshaken by anything Constance said in her own defense. Everyone had seen, and someone, finally, had cared enough to act. The carriages began arriving to collect departing guests as the sun dipped lower behind the tall hedges, and Evangeline understood, with a strange mixture of dread and cautious hope, that the ride home with her stepmother that evening would be unlike any she had endured before. Whatever waited for her within the walls of her own household, she no longer felt entirely alone in facing it, and that alone was more than she had possessed only a few short hours earlier. The carriage ride home felt longer than any journey Evangeline had ever taken, though the distance between Lord Carrington's estate and her own family home was no more than 3 miles. Constance sat across from her, back rigid, eyes fixed on the passing hedgerows outside the window, saying nothing at all. Charlotte and Beatrice sat pressed close together on the opposite seat, glancing occasionally at their mother, then at Evangeline, then quickly away again, as though afraid of drawing attention to themselves. Evangeline kept her own eyes lowered, her hands folded neatly in her lap, though her mind raced with everything that had happened. She could still feel the faint warmth on her cheek, where her stepmother's hand had landed, though the sting itself had long since faded. What remained was something deeper, a kind of disbelief that refused to settle, mixed with the strange, unfamiliar comfort of knowing that someone else had witnessed the truth of her life within that household. The wheels rattled over a rough patch of road, jostling them all slightly, and still no one spoke. Evangeline had grown skilled over the years at reading the moods of her stepmother, at sensing when silence meant simmering anger, and when it meant something closer to calculation. This silence felt like the latter. Constance was thinking, planning, deciding how best to handle what had happened, how to shape the story that would spread through the county in the coming days. When they finally arrived at the house, the carriage rolling to a stop before the wide stone steps, Constance did not wait for the footman to open the door before speaking. "Charlotte, Beatrice, go inside," she said, her voice clipped. "Evangeline will remain with me a moment." Her stepsisters exchanged a glance, but obeyed without argument, gathering their skirts and hurrying up the steps into the house, leaving Evangeline alone, with her stepmother in the fading evening light. The footman, sensing the tension, retreated a discreet distance, busying himself with the horses. "Do you understand what you have done?" Constance asked, her voice low and controlled, though Evangeline could hear the fury still simmering beneath the surface. "I answered a question honestly," Evangeline said quietly. "I did not intend to embarrass you." "Intend or not, you have given every gossiping tongue in this county something new to chew upon for weeks to come," Constance snapped. "Do you have any notion of how difficult it has been to maintain this family's standing since your father passed? Any notion of the sacrifices I have made to ensure that you and your sisters are received in the finest homes, invited to the finest gatherings?" Evangeline said nothing. She had learned long ago that arguing during these moments only prolonged them, that silence, however unsatisfying, was often the safest path through her stepmother's anger. "And now," Constance continued, "thanks to your careless tongue, the Duke of Foxmere himself has seen fit to lecture me in front of half the county, as though I were some common woman, deserving of public correction." "He only spoke the truth of what he witnessed," Evangeline said before she could stop herself. Constance's eyes narrowed sharply. "Do not test me further today, Evangeline. You have caused enough trouble for one afternoon." Evangeline lowered her gaze again, biting back the words that rose in her throat. There was so much she wished to say, so many years of quiet unfairness she wished to finally give voice to, but she knew this was not the moment. Constance's anger, when provoked further, had a way of finding new and creative avenues of punishment, and Evangeline had no desire to discover what form it might take this particular evening. "Go to your room," Constance said finally. "I do not wish to see your face again this evening." Evangeline obeyed without protest, climbing the stone steps and slipping into the house, grateful for the relative safety of her own small chamber at the end of the upstairs corridor. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a long moment, finally allowing herself to breathe fully for what felt like the first time since the garden party had begun. Her room was modest, far more modest than the rooms given to Charlotte and Beatrice, tucked away in a corner of the house that received little afternoon light. It had not always been this way. When her father was alive, Evangeline had occupied one of the finest rooms in the house, filled with sunlight and overlooking the gardens her father had so carefully cultivated. But after his passing, Constance had gradually reassigned the rooms, always with some practical-sounding reason, until Evangeline found herself relegated to this smaller space, as though her presence in the household had shrunk along with her father's protection. She moved to the window and looked out over the darkening grounds. The same orchard she had spoken of so innocently that afternoon, the very topic that had ignited her stepmother's fury. Her father had planted those trees himself, years before his marriage to Constance, and had always spoken of them with such tenderness, such pride in the tenant families who tended them and shared in their harvest each autumn. Since his passing, Evangeline had watched with quiet dismay as Constance slowly altered arrangements throughout the estate, reducing the tenants' shares, redirecting funds toward the household's more visible comforts, the gowns and carriages and social engagements that maintained their standing among the county's finest families. Evangeline had tried, on more than one occasion, to gently raise concerns about these changes, only to be reminded sharply that she had no authority over estate matters, that such decisions belonged to Constance alone, as the mistress of the household. She thought now of her father's will, a document she had seen only once, years ago, read aloud by the family solicitor shortly after her father's passing. She remembered certain phrases from that reading, promises made regarding her own future, provisions for the tenant families, arrangements that seemed, in memory, quite different from how the estate had actually been managed in the years since. But she had been so young then, so overwhelmed by grief, that the details had blurred together, and she had never dared ask to see the document again. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She turned, expecting perhaps Beatrice, who occasionally sought her out in quiet moments, despite their mother's disapproval, but instead found Margaret, the housekeeper who had served the Ashworth family since before Evangeline was born, standing in the doorway with a small tray. "I thought you might want something warm, miss," Margaret said gently, stepping into the room and setting the tray down on the small table near the window. "I heard what happened at the garden party. Word travels fast among the staff, even faster than among the guests, it seems." Evangeline managed a small, weary smile. "Thank you, Margaret. You needn't have troubled yourself." "It was no trouble at all," Margaret said, though her expression carried a concern that went beyond simple courtesy. "I only wish I could have been there. Your father would never have stood for such treatment, miss, not for a single moment." The mention of her father brought a familiar ache to Evangeline's chest. "Do you remember him well, Margaret? The years before he married Lady Constance?" Margaret's expression softened further, and she moved to sit in the chair opposite Evangeline's. An informality she would never have permitted herself with Constance present, but one that felt natural between them after so many years together. "I remember him very well, miss. A kind man, generous to a fault, some might have said. He loved this estate, loved the people who worked it. He spoke often of ensuring their fair treatment long after he was gone." "Do you remember his will?" Evangeline asked, her voice quiet. "The provisions he made?" Margaret hesitated, glancing toward the door, as though checking they were truly alone. "I remember there being talk among the staff, miss, about certain arrangements meant for you specifically, and for the tenant families as well. But such matters were always kept quiet, discussed only among the solicitors and your stepmother. I confess I never knew the particulars myself." Evangeline nodded slowly, filing this information away alongside her own hazy memories. "Do you think it's strange, Margaret, how differently the estate has been run since his passing?" Margaret's silence spoke volumes, though she chose her words carefully when she finally answered. "I think it is not my place to speak against the mistress of the house, miss, but I will say that many of the old tenant families have expressed their own quiet concerns over the years, changes to arrangements they had long believed permanent." It was as close to confirmation as Margaret was likely to offer, and Evangeline understood the housekeeper's caution. Constance held considerable power over every soul within this household, servants included, and speaking too openly against her carried real risk for those who depended on their positions for their livelihood. "Thank you for telling me what you could," Evangeline said softly, "and thank you for the tea." Margaret rose, smoothing her apron, though she paused at the door before leaving. "The Duke seemed a fine gentleman, miss, from what I heard of the tale. Word among the other household staff already speaks of how he stepped forward for you without hesitation. Such things do not go unnoticed, even below stairs." After Margaret departed, Evangeline sat alone with her tea, turning over the day's events in her mind again and again. She thought of the Duke's steady hand around her wrist, the calm authority in his voice as he addressed her stepmother, the genuine concern in his eyes when he had asked if she was injured. She thought, too, of his final words to her, before their paths parted at the end of the party, a quiet promise that he hoped to see her again soon, under happier circumstances. She had not allowed herself to consider what such words might mean, had trained herself over the years not to hope for things that seemed too far beyond her circumstances. But something about the day's events had cracked open a door she had long kept firmly closed. and she found herself, despite every instinct toward caution, wondering what might lie beyond it. Downstairs, meanwhile, Constance sat alone in the drawing room, a glass of sherry untouched on the table beside her, her mind working through the evening's disaster, with the same cold precision she applied to every challenge she faced. She had spent years building the reputation of a devoted, if firm, stepmother, carefully cultivating relationships with the county's most influential families, ensuring invitations to every gathering that mattered. A single afternoon's loss of temper threatened to unravel years of careful work. She thought of the Duke's words, the quiet menace beneath his calm delivery, and felt a fresh wave of frustration rise within her. She had not anticipated his intervention. Dukes, in her experience, rarely troubled themselves with the domestic affairs of families beneath their own standing, and she had assumed, wrongly it now seemed, that her position as mistress of a respected estate would insulate her from any real consequence. She would need to move carefully now. The story that spread through the county in coming days would matter enormously, and she intended to ensure that whatever version took root painted her in the most sympathetic light possible. A grieving widow, overwhelmed by the burdens of raising 3 daughters alone, momentarily overcome by frustration during a difficult conversation. It was not entirely untrue, she told herself, even as she knew the framing conveniently omitted rather significant details. Charlotte entered the drawing room quietly, taking a seat near her mother without being asked. "Mother," she said hesitantly, "will there be consequences? From the Duke, I mean." Constance's jaw tightened. "I do not know, Charlotte. Dukes are not accustomed to being defied, and I fear he took today's incident rather more personally than I would have liked. Perhaps," Charlotte said carefully, "it might be wise to smooth things over. A letter, perhaps, or some gesture of goodwill." Constance considered this for a long moment. "Perhaps," she agreed finally, "though I confess, I do not yet know what form such a gesture might take, given that his concern seemed directed entirely toward your stepsister, rather than toward myself." The words carried a bitterness that Charlotte recognized well, the familiar resentment her mother harbored toward Evangeline, a resentment that had only grown sharper over the years despite Evangeline's quiet, unassuming nature. Charlotte had never fully understood the depth of that resentment, though she suspected it had something to do with the will, with provisions made for Evangeline that her mother had long resented having to honor, or perhaps had found ways not to honor at all. Upstairs, Evangeline finally set aside her tea and moved to her small writing desk, retrieving a sheet of paper and a pen. She was not entirely certain what she intended to write, or to whom, but she felt a sudden urge to put her thoughts into some form, to capture the strange mixture of fear and hope that had settled over her since the afternoon's events. She began, hesitantly, a letter to no one in particular, simply a record of her own feelings, a way of making sense of a day that had upended so much of what she believed about her place in the world. She wrote of her father's orchards, of the tenant families she had grown up alongside, of the quiet injustices she had endured in silence for so many years. She wrote, too, of the Duke's steady hand and steadier voice, of the strange new possibility that perhaps she was not as powerless as she had long believed herself to be. As she wrote, a soft knock came at her window, faint but unmistakable, and she looked up with a start to find one of the stable boys standing below in the darkened garden, holding something up toward her window. She rose and opened the glass carefully, peering down into the dim evening light. "Beg your pardon, miss," the boy said quietly, glancing nervously toward the house, as though afraid of being seen. "A rider came by, not an hour past, asked me to deliver this to you directly, said it was important you receive it tonight." He held up a small folded letter, sealed with wax, and Evangeline felt her heart quicken as she reached down to accept it, careful to keep her voice low. "Thank you. Please, say nothing of this to anyone in the house." The boy nodded and slipped away into the darkness, and Evangeline closed her window, turning the sealed letter over in her hands. The wax bore no family crest she immediately recognized, though something about the careful, elegant handwriting on the front, spelling out her name alone, sent a small thrill of anticipation through her. She broke the seal carefully and unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the brief lines within, and as she read, she felt something within her chest loosen slightly, a small measure of the day's tension finally beginning to ease. The letter was brief, formal in its language but warm in its intent, expressing hope that she had suffered no lasting distress from the afternoon's unfortunate events, and requesting, if she found it agreeable, the honor of calling upon her family in the coming days to discuss a matter of some importance regarding her father's former acquaintance with his own family. It was signed simply, Nathaniel Ashford, Duke of Foxmere. Evangeline read the letter twice more, searching for hidden meanings, for any indication of what matter he might wish to discuss, though nothing in the careful, formal phrasing revealed more than what was plainly stated. Still, the very fact that he had written at all, that he had troubled himself to send a writer so soon after the party's conclusion, suggested that whatever concern had prompted his intervention that afternoon had not faded with the setting sun. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the drawer of her writing desk, beneath a small stack of her father's old correspondence that she had kept hidden from Constance's notice over the years. Whatever the Duke's true intentions, whatever the mysterious matter he wished to discuss, Evangeline understood that her quiet, careful existence within this household had shifted in some fundamental way that afternoon, and that the days ahead would likely bring changes she could not yet fully anticipate. Outside her window, the last light of evening finally faded into full darkness, and somewhere below, she could hear the faint murmur of her stepmother's voice, still drifting up from the drawing room, discussing, no doubt, how best to manage the fallout from the day's events. Evangeline extinguished her candle and lay down upon her narrow bed, her mind still racing with possibilities, with fragments of memory about her father's will, with the steady warmth of a duke's hand around her wrist. For the first time in longer than she could remember, sleep did not come easily that night, though the restlessness that kept her awake felt different from the anxious dread that so often haunted her thoughts. Tonight, threaded through her uncertainty, ran something she had almost forgotten how to feel at all. A quiet, cautious thread of hope. 3 days passed before the Duke's carriage appeared at the end of the long gravel drive leading up to the Ashworth estate, and in those 3 days, Evangeline had felt the household's tension stretch tighter with each passing hour. Constance had said little to her directly, though her silence carried its own weight, a simmering displeasure that seemed to fill every room she entered. Charlotte watched Evangeline with a curiosity she could not quite hide, while Beatrice, softer-natured than her sister, occasionally offered small kindnesses when their mother was not looking. A warm smile in the hallway, a quiet word of comfort. When word reached the house that a carriage bearing the Foxmere crest approached, Constance moved through the rooms like a woman preparing for battle, straightening portraits that did not need straightening, instructing the staff to bring out the finest tea service, and finally positioning herself in the drawing room with the practiced composure of a woman determined to present her household in its best possible light. Evangeline, meanwhile, had spent the morning in quiet anticipation, uncertain what to expect from this visit, though the Duke's letter had mentioned some matter concerning her father's former acquaintance with his own family. She had turned the phrase over countless times in her mind, searching for meaning, but arrived at no clear conclusion beyond a vague curiosity about what connection their families might share. When the Duke was finally announced, Evangeline rose from her seat near the window, smoothing her simple gray dress with hands that trembled slightly, despite her best efforts at composure. He entered the drawing room with the same quiet confidence she remembered from the garden party, offering a polite bow to Constance before his gaze found Evangeline, and something in his expression softened noticeably as their eyes met. "Your Grace," Constance said warmly, gesturing toward the finest chair in the room. "What an honor to receive you. I trust the journey from Foxmere was pleasant." "Quite pleasant, thank you," the Duke replied, though his tone carried a formal reserve that suggested he had not come merely for polite conversation. "I hope I find your household well, Lady Constance, and that no lasting unpleasantness remains from our previous meeting." Constance's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, Your Grace. A momentary lapse, nothing more. I do hope you will not judge our family too harshly, based on a single difficult afternoon. I judge families based on patterns, madam, rather than single moments," the Duke replied evenly, though I confess the afternoon in question left a considerable impression upon me. An uncomfortable silence followed, broken finally by Constance's insistence on ringing for tea, and the conversation shifted, somewhat awkwardly, toward safer topics: the weather, the upcoming autumn assemblies, mutual acquaintances among the county's finest families. Evangeline said little, content to observe, though she noticed the Duke's occasional glances toward her, brief but attentive, as though checking that she remained comfortable within the conversation's careful dance. After what felt like an appropriately polite interval, the Duke turned the discussion toward the matter he had mentioned in his letter. "I wonder, Lady Constance, if I might trouble you for a private word with Lady Evangeline. A matter concerning her late father has come to my attention, one I believe she alone can properly address." Constance's expression flickered with something Evangeline could not quite identify, though she recovered quickly, offering a gracious nod, despite the evident reluctance beneath it. "Of course, Your Grace. Perhaps the garden terrace would suit, weather permitting. I shall have tea brought out there directly." Evangeline felt her stepmother's eyes upon her as she rose to accompany the Duke, a warning glance that promised further conversation once their guest had departed, though for the moment, Constance said nothing more, simply watching as the two of them made their way toward the terrace doors. Once outside, away from the drawing room's careful formality, the Duke's manner relaxed somewhat, though his expression remained thoughtful, even slightly troubled. They walked slowly along the terrace, the afternoon sun warm upon the stone, and for a moment neither spoke, the silence comfortable rather than strained. "I confess," the Duke said finally, "that my letter's mention of a matter concerning your father was not entirely without foundation, though I fear I may have been somewhat vague in my explanation. I had wondered what connection our families might share," Evangeline admitted. "My father rarely spoke of the Foxmere estate, though I recall him mentioning acquaintance with your family on occasion. Your father and my own father were close friends in their younger years," the Duke explained, "before circumstances and distance gradually separated them. I discovered, only recently, a collection of old correspondence between them, while sorting through my father's papers following his passing several years ago. I had not thought much of it until the garden party, when your name and situation brought the connection freshly to mind." Evangeline's curiosity sharpened. "What did the letters contain, if I may ask?" The Duke's expression grew more serious. "Discussions of estate matters, mostly. Advice exchanged between friends on managing tenant relations, agricultural improvements, that sort of thing. But among them, I found several letters, written shortly before your father's passing, expressing certain concerns about the future management of his estate, and about provisions he wished to secure for you specifically." Evangeline's breath caught slightly. "What sort of provisions?" "I cannot speak to the precise details," the Duke said carefully, "as the letters were addressed to my father, rather than containing formal legal language. But your father expressed clear intentions regarding an inheritance, meant specifically for you, separate from whatever arrangements existed for your stepsisters, along with concerns about ensuring the tenant families received fair and continued treatment, regardless of who managed the estate after him." Evangeline stood very still, processing this information, feeling old, half-formed suspicions crystallizing into something more solid. "I have long wondered," she said slowly, "whether the estate has been managed according to my father's true wishes. The tenant families have quietly expressed their own concerns to our housekeeper over the years, changes to arrangements they believed permanent. I suspected as much," the Duke said, "which is precisely why I felt compelled to bring this matter to your attention, though I understand it places you in a delicate position, given your current household circumstances." Evangeline glanced back toward the house, aware that Constance likely watched their conversation from some concealed vantage point, though the terrace's distance from the drawing-room windows offered some measure of privacy. "May I ask, Your Grace, why you have taken such interest in this matter? We are barely acquainted, and yet you have gone to considerable trouble on my behalf." The Duke was quiet for a moment before answering, his gaze thoughtful. "I witnessed something at that garden party that troubled me deeply, Lady Evangeline. Not merely the moment itself, but what it suggested about the pattern of treatment you have likely endured for years without complaint. When I discovered my father's old correspondence and recognized your name among the letters, it felt almost as though circumstance had placed an obligation before me that I could not, in good conscience, ignore." "That is a great kindness," Evangeline said softly, "though I confess, I do not know what to do with such information. I have no access to my father's legal papers, no standing to question my stepmother's management of the estate." "That is precisely the matter I wish to discuss," the Duke said. "I have taken the liberty of consulting with my own solicitor, a man of considerable discretion and skill, regarding the proper channels through which such concerns might be investigated. If you are willing, and only if you are willing, I would like to arrange a meeting between yourself and my solicitor, to review what documentation might exist regarding your father's original will, and to determine whether the current management of the estate aligns with his stated intentions. Evangeline felt a complicated swirl of emotions rise within her, hope tangled together with fear, the possibility of finally uncovering the truth, mixed with dread at what consequences such an investigation might bring, both for herself and for the tenant families who depended on the estate's continued operation. "I fear my stepmother would not permit such an investigation," she said quietly. "She has always been quite firm about my lack of involvement in estate matters." "Then perhaps," the Duke suggested carefully, "such an investigation need not require her permission, at least initially. Solicitors are permitted, under certain circumstances, to review matters of public record, wills that have been formally probated, without requiring the consent of every interested party. I do not wish to encourage anything improper, Lady Evangeline, but I do believe you have every right to understand the true contents of your own father's final wishes." Evangeline considered this for a long moment, watching a pair of small birds dart between the terrace's stone planters, filled with late summer blooms that Constance had insisted upon planting, despite their considerable cost. She thought of her father, of his gentle voice and steady hands, of the promises he had made her in the quiet months before his passing, promises she had half forgotten in the years since, buried beneath grief and the slow, grinding weight of her stepmother's control. "I would like that very much, Your Grace," she said finally, her voice steadier than she expected. "Whatever the truth may be, I believe I deserve to know it." The Duke's expression eased into something like relief, though a seriousness remained beneath it. "I shall arrange the meeting for as soon as can be reasonably managed then. In the meantime, Lady Evangeline, I would advise a certain discretion. Should your stepmother suspect what we discuss here today, I fear she may take steps to conceal whatever documentation might exist before we have the opportunity to review it properly." "I understand," Evangeline said. "I have grown quite skilled, over the years, at concealing my true thoughts from her scrutiny." Something flickered across the Duke's face at this admission, a shadow of sympathy mixed with quiet anger on her behalf, though he said nothing further on the matter, simply nodding in acknowledgement before glancing toward the terrace doors, where a servant now approached bearing a tray of tea, sent no doubt by Constance to interrupt whatever private conversation had stretched longer than she found comfortable. They returned to more measured, careful conversation as the tea was served, discussing safer topics for the benefit of the servant's presence, though Evangeline found her mind still racing with everything the Duke had revealed. When Constance finally rejoined them on the terrace, her expression carefully composed but her eyes sharp with barely concealed curiosity, the Duke smoothly redirected the conversation toward general pleasantries, offering no hint of what had truly passed between them. "I do hope your business with Evangeline proved satisfactory, Your Grace," Constance said, her tone light but probing. "Quite satisfactory," the Duke replied easily. "A small matter concerning old family correspondence, nothing of great consequence, though I found the conversation most illuminating." Constance's eyes flickered toward Evangeline, searching for some sign of what had truly transpired, though Evangeline kept her expression carefully neutral, years of practice serving her well in this moment. Whatever suspicion lingered in her stepmother's gaze, she could find no confirmation of it in Evangeline's composed features. The visit concluded shortly after, the Duke offering his farewells with the same polished formality he had displayed upon arrival, though as he took his leave, he paused briefly beside Evangeline, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "I will send word once arrangements have been made," he said quietly. "In the meantime, please take care, Lady Evangeline." "Thank you, Your Grace," she replied softly, "for everything." As his carriage rolled away down the long gravel drive, Evangeline stood at the drawing-room window, watching until it disappeared entirely from view, her mind still turning over everything he had revealed. Behind her, she could feel her stepmother's presence, though for once, Constance said nothing, simply observing her stepdaughter's quiet contemplation, with an expression that suggested calculations of her own were already underway. That evening, as Evangeline prepared for bed, she found herself once again drawn to her father's old correspondence, hidden away in the small drawer of her writing desk. She read through the familiar letters once more, searching now for any hint of the provisions the Duke had mentioned, any mention of the inheritance her father had intended specifically for her. She found nothing conclusive, the letters too personal, too focused on everyday matters. to reveal the legal specifics she now desperately wished to understand. But as she finally set the letters aside and extinguished her candle, she felt something solidify within her that had not been present before. A quiet, determined resolve that had nothing to do with anger, and everything to do with a deep, abiding need to understand the truth of her own circumstances. Whatever the investigation revealed, whatever consequences followed from uncovering it, Evangeline understood now that she could no longer simply accept the quiet, diminished existence Constance had constructed for her since her father's passing. She thought of her father's orchards, of the tenant families who had quietly suffered under changes they had not agreed to, of the years of careful, unspoken injustice she had endured within her own home. And she thought, too, of the Duke's steady hand and steadier resolve, of his willingness to involve himself in a matter that concerned him not at all, simply because he had witnessed something wrong and refused to look away. Sleep came more easily that night than it had in days, though when it finally arrived, it carried with it dreams of orchards in full bloom, and of a truth long buried, finally beginning to surface into the light. A week after the Duke's visit, Evangeline sat alone in the estate's small library, a room Constance rarely visited since she found little interest in books beyond fashionable novels she displayed more than read. It had become, in recent years, one of the few places within the house where Evangeline felt truly at ease, surrounded by the leather-bound volumes her father had collected over a lifetime, many bearing his careful handwritten notes in the margins. She had come seeking a particular ledger she vaguely remembered from childhood, one her father had kept detailing the estate's tenant arrangements, hoping it might offer some clue about the original terms he had established before his passing. The search had proven more difficult than expected, the shelves reorganized at some point in the years since his death, likely by Constance's instruction, though whether from simple housekeeping or something more deliberate, Evangeline could not say. She had nearly given up the search when her fingers brushed against a slim volume tucked behind a row of larger books, clearly placed there to avoid casual notice. She pulled it free carefully, and found, to her surprise, not the ledger she sought, but a small bound collection of personal correspondence, her father's handwriting immediately recognizable on the yellowed pages within. Her heart quickened as she carefully turned through the pages, recognizing many of the letters as drafts, unfinished thoughts her father had apparently intended to send but perhaps never completed, or perhaps had sent in more polished form while keeping these rougher drafts for his own records. Near the back of the small collection, she found a letter addressed to the family solicitor, dated only months before her father's passing, and as she read through its contents, her breath caught sharply in her throat. The letter outlined, in her father's own careful words, specific provisions he wished included in his will, provisions for Evangeline's independent inheritance upon reaching her majority, or upon marriage, whichever came first, entirely separate from any arrangements made for Constance or her daughters. It spoke, too, of protections for the tenant families, specific terms ensuring their continued fair treatment, regardless of who managed the estate in his absence. Evangeline read the letter 3 times over, her hands trembling slightly, before carefully folding it and tucking it into the pocket of her dress. This was precisely the sort of documentation the Duke's solicitor would need to properly investigate whether her father's true wishes had been honored, and finding it felt like uncovering a piece of buried treasure long hidden beneath years of careful concealment. She was so absorbed in her discovery that she failed to hear the library door opening behind her, and when Charlotte's voice suddenly broke the silence, Evangeline nearly startled the small bound collection from her hands. "What are you doing in here?" Charlotte asked, her tone more curious than accusatory, though Evangeline's guilty flinch had clearly not escaped her notice. "Simply looking for something to read," Evangeline replied, forcing her voice into casual lightness, even as her heart continued to race. "What brings you to the library? You rarely venture in here." Charlotte's eyes narrowed slightly, drifting toward the small bundle of papers Evangeline had not quite managed to fully conceal within her pocket. "Mother sent me to fetch you. She wishes to speak with you regarding the household accounts." Evangeline felt a fresh wave of anxiety at this news, uncertain whether it signaled genuine household business or some deeper suspicion Constance harbored regarding the Duke's recent visit. "I shall come directly," she said, rising from her seat and carefully replacing the small bound collection back among the shelves, though she kept the crucial letter folded safely within her pocket. Charlotte lingered a moment longer, her gaze thoughtful. Evangeline, she said finally, her voice quieter than usual. What did the Duke truly wish to discuss with you last week? Mother has been most agitated ever since, though she will not say why. Evangeline hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal even to Beatrice's sister, whose loyalties, though not unkind, had always remained firmly with their mother. A matter concerning our father's old friendship, she said carefully, offering only the portion of truth that seemed safest. Nothing of great consequence. Charlotte studied her for a long moment, clearly unconvinced, though she said nothing further, simply turning to lead the way toward the drawing room where Constance waited. Evangeline followed, her mind racing through possible explanations she might offer if her stepmother pressed further, all while the crucial letter in her pocket seemed to burn against her skin, as though its mere presence might somehow reveal itself through the fabric. Constance sat at her writing desk when they entered, a ledger open before her, though her attention was clearly not focused on its contents. She looked up as Evangeline entered, her expression carefully composed, but her eyes sharp with an intensity that made Evangeline's stomach tighten with apprehension. "Close the door, Charlotte," Constance said, and Charlotte obeyed silently before retreating to a chair near the window, though whether to observe or simply await further instruction, Evangeline could not tell. "Sit down, Evangeline," Constance continued, gesturing toward the chair opposite her desk. "I wish to discuss the household accounts, as I mentioned, though, I confess my true purpose runs somewhat deeper." Evangeline sat carefully, folding her hands in her lap, willing them to remain steady, despite the anxiety building within her chest. "Of course." "I have been considering," Constance said, her tone deceptively mild, "the Duke's continued interest in our family's affairs since the garden party. It strikes me as rather unusual, does it not, for a man of his standing to concern himself so thoroughly with matters that seem, on the surface, to hold little relevance to his own estate." "I could not say what motivates his interest, Lady Constance," Evangeline replied carefully. "Perhaps simple courtesy, given the unfortunate circumstances of our first meeting." "Perhaps," Constance said, though her tone suggested she found this explanation entirely insufficient. "Or perhaps his interest runs toward matters somewhat closer to home, matters concerning your father's original arrangements for this estate." Evangeline felt her pulse quicken sharply, though she kept her expression as neutral as she could manage. "I do not understand your meaning." "Do you not?" Constance's eyes remained fixed on her, cold and calculating. "I have managed this estate faithfully since your father's passing, Evangeline. I have provided for you, educated you, ensured your place among the finest families of this county, despite the considerable burden of raising 3 daughters alone following his death. I would think you might show some measure of gratitude for these efforts, rather than encouraging outside interference into affairs that do not concern strangers, however titled they might be." "I have never sought to encourage anything of the sort," Evangeline said, her voice steadier than she felt. "The Duke's visit concerned matters between our late fathers, nothing more." "Then you will not object," Constance said smoothly, "to my reviewing whatever correspondence he might have shared with you, simply to satisfy my own curiosity regarding the nature of these old family matters." Evangeline's breath caught, understanding immediately the trap being laid before her. "He shared no written correspondence with me directly, Lady Constance. Our conversation was entirely verbal." Constance's eyes narrowed further, clearly searching for any crack in Evangeline's composure, though Evangeline held firm, years of careful practice serving her well in this moment, despite the racing anxiety beneath her calm exterior. "Very well," Constance said finally, though her tone made clear she remained unconvinced. "I trust, however, that you understand the importance of family loyalty, Evangeline. Whatever old connections your father maintained with the Foxmere family, I would not wish for outside parties to interfere unnecessarily in matters that belong properly within this household alone." "I understand," Evangeline said quietly, though internally she understood something quite different, a growing certainty that her stepmother's agitation stemmed from genuine fear of discovery rather than simple curiosity. Constance dismissed her shortly after, though her sharp gaze followed Evangeline's departure with unmistakable suspicion. As Evangeline made her way back toward her own room, the crucial letter still folded safely within her pocket, she found Beatrice waiting near the top of the staircase, her expression uncharacteristically serious. "Evangeline," Beatrice said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were alone, "I overheard Mother speaking with Charlotte earlier. before you arrived. She fears the Duke may have discovered something regarding father's will, something she has worked hard to keep concealed. Evangeline's heart quickened at this confirmation of her own suspicions. What did she say specifically, Beatrice? Beatrice glanced nervously toward the stairs below, clearly worried about being overheard. I could not hear all of it, but she mentioned altered documents, and something about ensuring certain papers remained where they could not easily be found. I do not fully understand what she meant, but she seemed most anxious about it. Evangeline felt a cold chill settle over her, despite the warmth of the afternoon. Altered documents. The phrase suggested something far more deliberate than simple mismanagement, something closer to deception, perhaps even fraud, though she dared not voice such suspicions aloud, even to Beatrice. Thank you for telling me this, Evangeline said softly. Please, be careful not to let your mother know you overheard, or that you shared it with me. Beatrice nodded, her expression still troubled. Evangeline, I do not fully understand everything happening between you and Mother, and between you and the Duke, but I have always felt that Mother treats you unfairly, more unfairly than she treats Charlotte or myself. If there is some truth being uncovered here, some wrong being made right, I would not wish to stand in its way. It was more open sympathy than Beatrice had ever offered before, and Evangeline felt a surprising warmth at her stepsister's quiet courage in sharing it. Thank you, Beatrice. That means more to me than you know. That evening, Evangeline sat alone in her room, the crucial letter spread before her on the writing desk, alongside a fresh sheet of paper, upon which she began carefully drafting her own account of the letter's contents, along with everything Beatrice had overheard regarding altered documents. She intended to send word to the Duke as soon as possible, though she understood now that Constance's suspicion had grown sharp enough that any obvious communication risked discovery. She thought of the stable boy who had delivered the Duke's letter that first night after the garden party, and resolved to seek his assistance once more, trusting that his earlier discretion suggested a loyalty that extended beyond simple duty. As she finished drafting her careful account, sealing it within a plain envelope devoid of any identifying marks, she heard footsteps pause briefly outside her door, lingering just long enough to make her heart leap with sudden fear, before continuing on down the corridor. She waited several long moments, straining to hear any further sound, before finally rising to check that her door remained securely latched. Whatever games her stepmother now played, whatever suspicions drove her renewed scrutiny, Evangeline understood that the coming days would require considerably more caution than she had exercised thus far. She extinguished her candle and lay down upon her narrow bed, the sealed letter tucked safely beneath her pillow until morning, when she intended to seek out the stable boy once more. Sleep proved elusive that night, her mind turning over Beatrice's troubling revelation again and again, the phrase altered documents echoing through her thoughts like a warning bell she could not silence. Whatever truth lay buried within her father's original will, whatever deception Constance had employed to conceal it these many years, Evangeline understood now that uncovering it would require more courage and considerably more caution than she had yet displayed. The path forward remained uncertain, fraught with risks she could barely begin to anticipate. But for the first time since her father's passing, she felt a fierce, determined resolve settling over her, a refusal to remain silent any longer in the face of injustice she had endured for far too many years. The stable boy, whose name Evangeline finally learned was Peter, accepted her sealed letter early the following morning with a solemn nod, promising to find a rider bound for Foxmere before the day's chores demanded his full attention. Evangeline thanked him quietly, pressing a small coin into his palm despite his protests that no payment was necessary, and watched from behind the stable door until he disappeared down the lane on his errand. She spent the remainder of that day in careful, deliberate normalcy, attending to small household tasks, sitting with Beatrice over needlework in the drawing room, doing everything within her power to avoid drawing further suspicion from Constance, who watched her throughout the day with an intensity that made Evangeline's skin prickle with unease. It was nearly evening when Margaret found her in the garden, her expression tight with worry as she approached. "Miss Evangeline," she said quietly, glancing back toward the house, "I must speak with you a moment, though I fear what I have to say will trouble you greatly." "What is it, Margaret?" Evangeline asked, setting aside the small basket of cut flowers she had been gathering. "Lady Constance summoned me to her study this afternoon," Margaret said, her voice low. She questioned me at length about your movements these past weeks, asked whether I had noticed you spending unusual time in the library, or receiving any unexpected correspondence. Evangeline's stomach tightened. What did you tell her? I told her nothing of consequence, miss, though I fear my denials did little to satisfy her suspicions. She has instructed the staff to report directly to her, regarding your comings and goings, and I overheard her speaking with her lady's maid about having your room searched while you attend chapel this coming Sunday. Evangeline felt a fresh wave of alarm at this news. The letter from her father, still hidden within her room, would be discovered if such a search took place, undoing every careful step she had taken thus far. Thank you for warning me, Margaret. I must find somewhere safer to keep certain items before Sunday arrives. There is more, miss, Margaret continued, her expression growing graver still. I overheard mention of a gentleman, a Mr. Whitfield, being summoned to the house tomorrow. I believe he serves as the family solicitor, though I have never met him myself. Lady Constance seemed most anxious that certain papers be reviewed and, I fear, possibly destroyed before any outside party gains access to them. Evangeline's breath caught sharply. If Constance intended to destroy the original will, or whatever documentation remained of her father's true intentions, the truth might be lost entirely before the Duke's solicitor ever had opportunity to review it. Margaret, is there anywhere within this house where important papers might be kept, somewhere I have not yet thought to search? Margaret considered this carefully. There is a locked cabinet within your late father's former study, miss. One Lady Constance has kept sealed since his passing. I have only ever seen her enter it herself, always alone, always with considerable care taken to ensure privacy. This was news to Evangeline, who had rarely ventured into her father's old study since his death, the room having become something of a shrine to old grief she had long avoided disturbing. Do you know where the key might be kept? I believe Lady Constance carries it upon her person at all times, miss, along with several other keys of importance. I have never seen it left unattended, not even for a moment. Evangeline's mind raced through possibilities, none of them promising. Without access to that locked cabinet, she had no way of confirming what documents Constance might be planning to alter or destroy before the solicitor's visit the following day. I must find some way to delay Mr. Whitfield's visit, or at least ensure the Duke learns of it before any damage is done. That evening, she composed a second hurried letter, this one carrying considerably more urgency than her first, detailing everything Margaret had shared regarding the impending solicitor's visit and the possible destruction of crucial documentation. She sealed it carefully, and once again sought Peter's assistance, finding him tending the horses in the stable yard as the last light of day faded into darkness. I need this delivered tonight, if at all possible, she said quietly, pressing the sealed letter into his hands along with additional coin. It is a matter of considerable urgency, Peter. I would not ask this of you if I believed any other course available to me. Peter studied the letter for a moment, before nodding firmly. I shall ride myself, miss, rather than waiting for another messenger. Foxmere is not so far that I cannot manage the distance and return before morning chores, provided I leave within the hour. Evangeline felt a rush of gratitude at his willingness to take such trouble on her behalf. Thank you, Peter. I shall not forget this kindness. You have always treated the staff fairly, miss, unlike some in this household, Peter said quietly, tucking the letter safely within his coat. It is little enough, what I can offer in return. She watched him saddle a horse and disappear into the darkening lane, praying silently that his journey would prove swift and safe, and that whatever action the Duke might take upon receiving her warning would arrive in time to prevent whatever scheme Constance had planned for the following day. Returning to the house, Evangeline found herself unable to settle into sleep, her mind circling endlessly through possible outcomes. If Constance succeeded in destroying the crucial documentation before the Duke's solicitor arrived, the truth of her father's original will might be lost forever, leaving her with no legal recourse against whatever arrangement Constance had constructed in its place. But if the Duke received her warning in time, if some intervention proved possible before the following day's events unfolded, perhaps there remained hope of preserving whatever truth still existed within that locked cabinet. She rose before dawn, restless and anxious, and made her way quietly downstairs, hoping to gather some sense of the household's mood before the day's events began in earnest. She found Constance already awake, seated in the small breakfast room, her expression carrying the particular sharpness of someone who had slept poorly. her mind evidently occupied with the day's planned business. "You are awake early," Constance observed, her tone carrying a note of suspicion that had become increasingly familiar in recent days. "I could not sleep," Evangeline replied honestly, taking her seat at the table with as much composure as she could manage. "Mr. Whitfield arrives this morning," Constance said, watching Evangeline's reaction carefully as she spoke. "A routine matter concerning the estate's quarterly accounts. Nothing that need concern you directly." "Of course," Evangeline said, keeping her voice carefully neutral, despite the anxious racing of her thoughts. The morning passed with agonizing slowness, Evangeline finding it nearly impossible to focus on any task set before her, her attention constantly drawn toward the window overlooking the front drive, watching for any sign of the Duke's carriage, or any indication that her warning had reached him in time. By mid-morning, a plain carriage arrived, bearing a stern-faced man, Evangeline assumed to be Mr. Whitfield, and she watched with mounting dread as Constance greeted him warmly at the door, leading him quickly toward her father's old study. Nearly an hour passed with no sign of intervention, and Evangeline's hope began to falter, wondering whether Peter's journey had proven unsuccessful, or whether the Duke had simply been unable to act quickly enough to prevent whatever was now unfolding behind that locked study door. She had nearly resigned herself to the worst when the sound of another carriage approaching the drive caught her attention, and her heart leapt as she recognized, even from a distance, the unmistakable crest of Foxmere upon its door. The Duke emerged from his carriage with brisk purpose, accompanied by another gentleman Evangeline did not recognize, likely his own solicitor, and together they approached the house with evident determination. Evangeline hurried to the entrance hall, arriving just as the housekeeper opened the door to admit them, and found herself exchanging a brief, meaningful glance with the Duke, before Constance's voice rang out sharply from the direction of her father's old study. "Your Grace," Constance said, emerging quickly into the hallway, her expression carefully composed, despite the evident alarm beneath it. "This is most unexpected. I fear we were not anticipating visitors this morning." "My apologies for the lack of formal notice, Lady Constance," the Duke replied smoothly, though his tone carried an unmistakable firmness. "A matter of some urgency has arisen, one I believe concerns documentation, currently under review within your household. I have brought my own solicitor, Mr. Grayson, who I believe may offer useful counsel regarding certain legal matters connected to the late Lord Ashworth's estate." Constance's composure flickered visibly at this, her eyes darting briefly toward the study door, still slightly ajar behind her. "I am not certain what matter you refer to, Your Grace, though I assure you, our own solicitor, Mr. Whitfield, is more than capable of managing any legal concerns connected to this household." "I do not doubt Mr. Whitfield's competence," the Duke replied evenly, "though I believe it would benefit all parties involved to ensure complete transparency regarding the original terms of Lord Ashworth's will, particularly given certain discrepancies that have come to my attention." The word discrepancies seemed to land like a physical blow, and Evangeline watched her stepmother's face pale slightly, despite her evident efforts to maintain composure. Behind her, in the doorway of the study, Mr. Whitfield appeared, a stack of papers clutched in his hands, his expression uncertain as he registered the tension unfolding in the hallway. "Your Grace," Mr. Whitfield said carefully, stepping forward, "might I ask the nature of these discrepancies you mention? I have served this family's legal interests for many years, and I would be most troubled to learn of any irregularity I have overlooked." "Perhaps," the Duke suggested, "we might discuss the matter properly, all parties present, rather than continuing this conversation in the hallway. I believe Lady Evangeline, in particular, has considerable interest in ensuring her late father's true wishes are honored." Constance's eyes flickered toward Evangeline, with something approaching fury, though she quickly composed herself, offering a stiff nod. "Very well, Your Grace. Perhaps we might convene in the drawing room, where this matter can be discussed with appropriate privacy." As they moved toward the drawing room, Evangeline felt a surge of cautious relief, mixed with considerable apprehension. Whatever truth lay hidden within that locked cabinet, whatever discrepancies the Duke had uncovered through his own investigations, the moment of reckoning had finally arrived, considerably sooner than she had anticipated, and considerably more publicly than she had hoped for. But as she took her seat within the drawing room, watching the careful, tense arrangement of solicitors and stepmother and Duke settling into their respective positions, she understood that whatever followed in the coming hour would likely determine the entire course of her future. The drawing room felt smaller than Evangeline remembered, as the small assembly settled into their seats, the air thick with unspoken tension that seemed to press against the very walls. Constance sat rigid in her favorite chair near the fireplace, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while Mr. Whitfield took a seat nearby, his expression carrying the uneasy look of a man uncertain whether he stood on solid ground or approaching quicksand. The Duke remained standing near the window, his own solicitor, Mr. Grayson, settling into a chair with a leather satchel of papers resting upon his knees. Evangeline chose a seat slightly apart from the others, close enough to observe everything unfolding, but positioned in a way that allowed her to watch each face carefully as the conversation began. Beatrice and Charlotte, summoned by their mother's insistence that the entire family be present, sat quietly near the door, their expressions ranging from Charlotte's guarded wariness to Beatrice's open, anxious curiosity. "Perhaps," the Duke began, his tone measured but firm, "we might start with Mr. Whitfield explaining the circumstances under which the late Lord Ashworth's will was originally probated, and the specific provisions it contained." Mr. Whitfield cleared his throat uncomfortably, glancing briefly toward Constance before answering. "The will was probated in the standard manner, Your Grace, shortly after Lord Ashworth's passing. It provided for the continued management of the estate under Lady Constance's guardianship until such time as his daughters reached their majority, at which point certain provisions would take effect regarding their respective inheritances." "And what were those specific provisions?" the Duke pressed. "The will established equal provisions for all three daughters," Mr. Whitfield said, though his voice carried a slight hesitation that Evangeline noted immediately, with the estate itself passing eventually to whichever daughter married first, or, absent marriage, divided equally among all three upon reaching their respective majorities. Evangeline felt a cold certainty settle over her at these words. "That is not what my father intended," she said quietly, though her voice carried clearly through the room. "I recall, even as a young woman still deep in grief, hearing different terms read aloud at the time of his passing." All eyes turned toward her, and Constance's expression sharpened into something close to alarm. "You were very young at the time, Evangeline, and grief affects memory considerably. I assure you the will was read exactly as Mr. Whitfield describes." "Then perhaps," the Duke said smoothly, reaching into his own coat and withdrawing a folded letter, "you might explain this correspondence, written in Lord Ashworth's own hand, to my late father, discussing quite different intentions regarding his estate." He handed the letter to Mr. Grayson, who read through it briefly, before passing it to Mr. Whitfield, whose face grew increasingly pale as he reviewed its contents. "This letter discusses an independent inheritance, intended specifically for Lady Evangeline," Mr. Whitfield said slowly, "separate from any arrangement involving her stepsisters, along with specific protections for the tenant family's continued fair treatment." "That letter proves nothing," Constance said sharply, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "A man's private correspondence, expressing hopes or intentions, holds no legal standing against a properly probated will." "Perhaps not on its own," the Duke agreed, "though I wonder, Mr. Whitfield, whether you might recall the precise circumstances under which the will's final language came to be finalized. I understand from my own inquiries that certain revisions were made in the weeks immediately preceding Lord Ashworth's passing, during a period when his health had already begun to decline significantly." Mr. Whitfield's discomfort grew visibly more pronounced. "There were certain amendments made during that period, yes, Your Grace, though such amendments are not uncommon as circumstances change near the end of a person's life." "And who requested those amendments?" the Duke asked, his gaze steady on the solicitor. A long, uncomfortable silence followed, during which Constance's face grew increasingly rigid, her composure clearly straining under the weight of the conversation's direction. Finally, Mr. Whitfield spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "The amendments were requested by Lady Constance, Your Grace, though Lord Ashworth's signature does appear upon the final document." Evangeline felt the room seem to tilt slightly around her, the confirmation of her deepest suspicions landing with a force that left her momentarily unable to speak. Her father's true wishes, so carefully expressed in that private letter, had been quietly overwritten in his final weeks, likely while illness had weakened both his body and his ability to fully comprehend or resist whatever pressure had been applied. Was my father of sound mind when these amendments were made? Evangeline finally managed to ask, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts at composure. Mr. Whitfield hesitated, glancing again toward Constance, who now sat with her jaw clenched tightly, her eyes fixed on some point across the room, refusing to meet anyone's gaze directly. His condition had grown considerably weaker in his final weeks, Lady Evangeline. I confess I harbored some reservations at the time regarding the propriety of finalizing such significant amendments during that period, though I was assured by Lady Constance that these changes reflected Lord Ashworth's genuine and clearly expressed wishes. "And did you witness him expressing those wishes directly?" the Duke asked pointedly. Another uncomfortable silence stretched through the room before Mr. Whitfield finally answered, his voice heavy with what appeared to be genuine regret. "I did not witness a direct conversation, Your Grace. The amended language was presented to me by Lady Constance, along with assurances that Lord Ashworth himself had approved the changes. I obtained his signature during a brief visit, though I confess he appeared quite weak at the time, and our exchange was necessarily brief given his evident discomfort." Evangeline turned toward her stepmother, a fierce, righteous anger finally breaking through years of carefully suppressed emotion. "You changed his wishes while he lay dying, unable to properly understand or resist what you were doing to him." "I did what was necessary to protect this family's future," Constance said sharply, finally breaking her silence, though her voice carried a note of defensive desperation rather than her usual cold confidence. "Your father's original intentions would have left this estate divided in ways that threatened its very survival, favoring you above your sisters in a manner I consider deeply unfair, given that Charlotte and Beatrice are equally his daughters in every meaningful sense." "They are his stepdaughters," Evangeline said, her voice steady despite the anger coursing through her. "Just as I am your stepdaughter. My father made his wishes clear, wishes that included fair provisions for the tenant families who depended upon this estate's proper management, provisions you have systematically ignored and altered to serve your own purposes." "I have managed this estate as I saw fit," Constance said, though her voice had grown considerably less certain, "and I do not believe a young woman's grief, addled memories of conversations held years ago, constitute sufficient grounds to overturn a properly probated will." "Perhaps not on their own," the Duke interjected calmly, though combined with written correspondence in Lord Ashworth's own hand, along with a solicitor's own admission that he harbored reservations about the circumstances under which the amendments were finalized, I believe sufficient grounds exist to warrant a formal legal inquiry into the will's validity. Constance's face had gone entirely pale now, her earlier confidence completely dissolved. "You cannot be serious, Your Grace. Such an inquiry would create considerable scandal, would drag this family's private affairs through public scrutiny in the most humiliating manner imaginable." "Perhaps," the Duke said, "you should have considered such consequences before altering a dying man's final wishes to serve your own interests rather than his." Evangeline sat quietly, amid the escalating tension, watching her stepmother's careful composure crumble entirely before her eyes, years of quiet injustice finally being exposed for what they truly were. She felt no particular satisfaction in the moment, only a deep, aching sadness for her father, who had spent his final weeks believing his wishes would be honored, never knowing that his own wife would work to undo them before his body had even grown cold. Charlotte, who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange, finally spoke, her voice small and uncertain. "Mother, is this true? Did you truly change Father's will while he lay dying?" Constance turned toward her daughter, and for a brief moment, something like genuine anguish flickered across her carefully composed features. "I did what I believed necessary to secure our family's future, Charlotte. You must understand, your own inheritance depended upon these changes. At the cost of Evangeline's rightful inheritance," Beatrice said quietly, her voice carrying more conviction than Evangeline had ever heard from her gentle stepsister, "and at the cost of deceiving a dying man, and every tenant family who depended upon his true wishes being honored." The room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence, broken finally by Mr. Whitfield, who rose from his seat with visible discomfort. "I believe, given what has been revealed here today, that I have no choice but to recommend a formal review of the will's circumstances be conducted by an independent authority. I cannot, in good conscience, continue to represent this family's interests without such a review taking place." Constance said nothing further, her earlier defiance having completely collapsed into something closer to defeat, though a hard, calculating light still remained in her eyes, suggesting she had not yet entirely surrendered whatever schemes might still remain available to her. Evangeline watched her stepmother's face carefully, understanding that whatever legal proceedings followed in the coming weeks, the true battle for her father's honor, and for the truth of his final wishes, had only just begun. In the days following that tense gathering in the drawing room, the Ashworth estate settled into an uneasy quiet, the kind that follows a storm before anyone fully understands whether the worst has truly passed. Mr. Whitfield had departed that same afternoon, promising to initiate formal inquiries with the appropriate legal authorities, though he cautioned that such proceedings often moved slowly, particularly when they touched upon matters as delicate as a dying man's altered final wishes. Constance had retreated into a cold, brittle silence, speaking to Evangeline only when absolutely necessary, though the open hostility that might once have accompanied such silence had transformed into something more calculating, more watchful. Evangeline understood instinctively that her stepmother had not accepted defeat, merely retreated to consider her next course of action, and this understanding kept her own guard raised throughout every quiet hour of those uncertain days. The Duke had returned to Foxmere following the confrontation, though he sent word through a properly delivered letter, this one requiring no secretive stable boy or midnight rider, expressing his continued commitment to seeing the matter through to its proper conclusion, along with his hope that Evangeline remained safe and well within her current circumstances. Evangeline found herself reading his words more carefully than perhaps was strictly necessary, searching for meanings beyond the plain courtesy of his phrasing, though she chided herself gently each time for such foolish hope. It was nearly a week later when Beatrice sought her out in the garden, her expression carrying an urgency that immediately caught Evangeline's attention. "Evangeline," she said quietly, glancing back toward the house to ensure they remained unobserved, "I must tell you something I overheard, though I fear it will trouble you greatly." "What is it?" Evangeline asked, setting aside the small trowel she had been using to tend her father's old rose bushes, a task that had become something of a quiet comfort in recent days. "Mother has been in correspondence with Lord Pemberton," Beatrice said, her voice hushed. "I do not know the full details, but I overheard her speaking with Charlotte about arranging a marriage, one she believes would resolve certain difficulties currently facing this family." Evangeline felt a cold unease settle over her. A marriage for whom? Beatrice's expression grew even more troubled. "For you, Evangeline. Lord Pemberton is considerably older, a widower with grown children of his own, though he possesses considerable wealth and standing. I believe Mother intends to arrange the match quickly, before any legal inquiry into Father's will can proceed further." "Why would such a marriage resolve anything?" Evangeline asked, though even as she spoke the question, a terrible understanding began forming in her mind. "Because," Beatrice said slowly, "once you are married, any inheritance you might claim would legally pass to your husband's control, rather than remaining independently yours. I believe Mother hopes that if the marriage is arranged before the legal review concludes, whatever provisions Father originally intended for you would become considerably more difficult to enforce, since your husband, rather than you yourself, would hold the primary interest in any resulting settlement." Evangeline's breath caught sharply at this revelation. Marrying her off quickly, to a man she barely knew, would effectively remove her from any position of independent claim over her father's estate, transferring whatever inheritance she might win through legal proceedings directly into a husband's control instead, a husband likely selected specifically for his willingness to cooperate with whatever arrangement Constance proposed. "When does she intend for this marriage to take place?" Evangeline asked, her voice tight with barely controlled alarm. "I do not know precisely," Beatrice admitted, "though I overheard mention of Lord Pemberton visiting within the fortnight, ostensibly to discuss business matters, though I believe the true purpose concerns arranging your betrothal directly." Evangeline's mind raced through the implications of this news. If Constance succeeded in arranging such a marriage before the legal inquiry concluded, whatever truth had been uncovered regarding her father's altered will might ultimately prove meaningless, the practical consequences of the fraud remaining firmly in place despite its exposure. She needed to warn the Duke immediately, needed to understand what legal protections, if any, existed to prevent such a hasty marriage from being forced upon her against her wishes. That evening, she composed another careful letter, detailing everything Beatrice had shared, and once again sought Peter's assistance in ensuring its swift delivery. The stable boy, now well accustomed to these secretive errands, accepted the task without hesitation, promising to see it delivered before morning. 2 days later, the Duke's carriage once again appeared at the estate, though this time his visit carried none of the careful formality of previous encounters. He requested an immediate private audience with Evangeline, and though Constance's expression suggested considerable displeasure at this demand, she could hardly refuse a Duke's request without raising further suspicion regarding her own intentions. They met once again on the garden terrace, though the Duke's expression carried a seriousness that immediately confirmed Evangeline's worst fears regarding the urgency of the situation. "I received your letter," he said without preamble. "I have consulted further with Mr. Grayson regarding the legal implications of a hasty marriage, and I fear your concerns are entirely justified." "What can be done to prevent it?" Evangeline asked, her voice steady, despite the anxiety churning within her. "Legally," the Duke said carefully, "very little can prevent your stepmother from arranging a marriage, provided you are of sufficient age, and provided the match does not violate any existing legal protections established under your father's original will, assuming that will's validity is eventually restored through the ongoing inquiry." "Then what course remains available to me?" Evangeline pressed. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful, before he finally spoke. "The most direct protection against such a forced arrangement would be your own refusal to consent to the marriage. No respectable clergyman would perform a ceremony without your explicit agreement, and no court would recognize a marriage entered into under genuine duress, should such circumstances later come to light. My stepmother has considerable skill in making refusal seem impossible," Evangeline said quietly. "She has spent years ensuring I understand the practical consequences of defying her wishes." "I understand," the Duke said, his voice gentler now, "which is precisely why I wish to speak with you directly, rather than relying solely on written correspondence for such a delicate matter. Lady Evangeline, I would ask that you trust in your own strength, in your own right to refuse an arrangement that serves your stepmother's interests rather than your own. Whatever pressure she applies, I would ask that you hold firm, and know that you do not face this challenge entirely alone." Something in his words, in the quiet conviction behind them, steadied Evangeline's racing thoughts considerably. "Thank you, Your Grace. Your support means more to me than I can properly express." "There is more," the Duke continued, his expression growing somewhat more complicated. "I have given considerable thought to your circumstances these past weeks, Lady Evangeline, and I find myself increasingly troubled by the precariousness of your position within your own household. I wonder whether you might consider an alternative course, one that would remove you entirely from your stepmother's authority, while the legal inquiry proceeds." "What alternative do you propose?" Evangeline asked, curious, despite the caution years of careful self-protection had instilled within her. The Duke hesitated, an unfamiliar uncertainty crossing his usually composed features. "My own aunt, Lady Winterbourne, maintains a household not far from Foxmere, and has long expressed interest in taking on a companion of good character and gentle disposition. I believe she would welcome your presence most warmly, and such an arrangement would place you entirely beyond your stepmother's immediate authority, while these legal matters resolve themselves properly." Evangeline considered this proposal carefully, recognizing both its practical wisdom and the considerable courage it would require to actually remove herself from her stepmother's household, an action that would surely provoke fierce resistance from Constance, regardless of whatever legal justification existed for such a move. "I would need to consider such a step very carefully," she said finally, "though I confess, the prospect holds considerable appeal, given everything currently unfolding within this household. I would not wish to pressure you toward any decision that does not feel entirely your own," the Duke said gently. "But I would ask that you consider it, particularly given the urgency Lord Pemberton's impending visit now presents." They spoke further of practical details, of how such a transition might be arranged discreetly, of what legal standing Evangeline might claim in removing herself from Constance's household given her approaching majority within the coming months. By the time their conversation concluded, Evangeline felt a new resolve settling over her, considerably stronger than the anxious uncertainty that had gripped her only hours before. As the Duke prepared to take his leave, he paused once more beside her, his expression carrying a warmth that extended beyond simple concern for her legal circumstances. "Whatever course you choose, Lady Evangeline, I want you to know that my interest in your well-being extends beyond the matter of your father's will alone. I have come to hold you in considerable regard these past weeks, and I would not wish to see you forced into any arrangement that brings you unhappiness." Evangeline felt her cheeks warm at these words, a complicated mixture of hope and caution rising within her. "I hold you in considerable regard as well, Your Grace, though I confess, I hardly know what to make of such feelings given the uncertainty currently surrounding my own future." "Then perhaps," the Duke said softly, "we might allow that future to unfold with patience, rather than rushing toward conclusions neither of us yet feels fully prepared to embrace." As his carriage departed once again down the long gravel drive, Evangeline remained on the terrace, watching until it disappeared from view, her mind and heart both considerably fuller than they had been only hours before. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever schemes Constance still harbored regarding Lord Pemberton's impending visit, Evangeline understood now that she possessed both allies and options she had not believed available to her only weeks earlier, and this understanding gave her a strength she had not known she still possessed. Lord Pemberton arrived precisely on schedule, exactly a fortnight after Beatrice's warning had first reached Evangeline in the quiet of the garden. His carriage rolled up the gravel drive on a gray, overcast afternoon, and Evangeline watched from her bedroom window as a heavy-set man of perhaps 50 years descended slowly, his movements deliberate and somewhat labored, aided by a servant who hovered close at his side. Constance greeted him with all the warmth she typically reserved for guests whose favor she wished to secure, ushering him into the drawing room with practiced graciousness while instructing the staff to prepare the finest refreshments the household could offer. Evangeline was summoned shortly after, dressed carefully by Constance's own explicit instruction, in a gown considerably finer than her usual modest attire, one that had clearly been selected to present her in the most favorable possible light. "Lord Pemberton," Constance said warmly, as Evangeline entered the drawing room, "may I present my stepdaughter, Lady Evangeline Ashworth?" Lord Pemberton rose with some effort, offering a formal bow that seemed to cost him considerable exertion. "Lady Evangeline," he said, his voice carrying a wheeze that suggested some difficulty with his breathing, "your stepmother speaks most highly of your accomplishments and your gentle disposition." "You are very kind, my lord," Evangeline replied, taking her seat with careful composure, despite the anxiety churning beneath her calm exterior. The conversation that followed proved excruciating in its careful, deliberate pleasantries, Constance steering every exchange with practiced skill toward topics designed to showcase Evangeline's virtues, while carefully avoiding any mention of the legal complications currently surrounding her father's will. Lord Pemberton, for his part, seemed genuinely charmed by Evangeline's quiet grace, though his conversation revealed little beyond a fondness for his country estate and considerable pride in his late wife's excellent management of his household affairs before her passing several years prior. "I confess," he said at one point, addressing Constance rather than Evangeline directly, as though discussing a business transaction rather than a potential marriage, "I have found myself in need of a suitable companion these past years, someone capable of managing my household with the same care my late wife once provided. Lady Evangeline's reputation for gentle competence has reached me through several mutual acquaintances, and I confess considerable interest in pursuing a more formal arrangement between our families." Evangeline felt her stomach tighten uncomfortably at hearing herself discussed in such transactional terms, as though she were a piece of property being evaluated for its usefulness, rather than a person with her own thoughts and preferences regarding her future. "I believe such an arrangement would prove most beneficial for all parties involved," Constance said smoothly, her eyes flickering briefly toward Evangeline, with an expression that carried unmistakable warning. "Evangeline has always shown considerable aptitude for household management, and I believe she would make an excellent companion for a gentleman of your standing, my lord. Perhaps," Lord Pemberton suggested, "Lady Evangeline and I might take a brief turn about the garden, to become somewhat better acquainted before we discuss matters further." Evangeline felt trapped by the polite formality of the request, understanding that refusal would appear inexplicably rude, given the circumstances Constance had carefully constructed. She rose and accompanied Lord Pemberton toward the garden doors, aware of Constance's watchful gaze following their departure. Once outside, away from the drawing room's careful pretense, Lord Pemberton's manner relaxed somewhat, though his conversation remained focused largely on practical matters rather than anything resembling genuine courtship. "I understand," he said as they walked slowly along the garden path, "that your father's estate has recently become subject to some manner of legal review." Lady Constance mentioned the matter only briefly, though I confess it raised certain questions in my mind. "The matter concerns provisions my father originally intended for my inheritance," Evangeline said carefully, choosing her words with considerable caution. "Provisions that were altered without his full understanding during his final illness." Lord Pemberton's expression grew thoughtful. "A troubling situation, though I confess, such legal complications need not necessarily interfere with our own arrangement, should we proceed toward marriage. Whatever inheritance you eventually secure would, of course, become part of our shared household finances upon our union." The casual, matter-of-fact way he mentioned claiming her potential inheritance as simply part of our shared household finances confirmed everything Beatrice had warned her of, and Evangeline felt a fresh wave of determination solidifying within her. This man, however pleasant his manner, viewed their potential marriage primarily as a practical arrangement that would conveniently resolve whatever legal complications currently threatened her stepmother's control over the estate's disputed inheritance. "My lord," Evangeline said carefully, "I confess I have given very little thought to marriage thus far. Given the considerable uncertainty currently surrounding my family's circumstances, I would not wish to enter into any arrangement while such matters remain unresolved." Lord Pemberton's expression flickered with something like mild surprise, clearly unaccustomed to any hesitation regarding what he likely considered a generous and advantageous proposal. "I understand such caution, Lady Evangeline, though I would gently suggest that a swift resolution to your current circumstances might prove considerably more beneficial than allowing such legal complications to drag on indefinitely." "Perhaps," Evangeline said, choosing her words carefully, "though I believe I would prefer to see these matters properly resolved before considering any further commitments regarding my own future." They returned to the drawing room shortly after, and Evangeline could see immediately from Constance's sharp, questioning glance that her stepmother sensed something had shifted during their private conversation. Lord Pemberton took his leave not long after, offering polite but somewhat cooler farewells than his earlier warmth had suggested, promising to consider matters further before proceeding with any formal proposal. Once his carriage had departed, Constance turned on Evangeline with barely contained fury. "What did you say to him?" He seemed considerably less enthusiastic upon his departure than he had been upon arrival. "I simply expressed honest reservations about proceeding with marriage while our family's legal circumstances remain unresolved," Evangeline said, meeting her stepmother's furious gaze with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "You foolish girl," Constance snapped, her composure finally cracking entirely under the weight of her frustration. "Do you have any understanding of the opportunity you have just jeopardized? Lord Pemberton represents considerable security, considerable stability, precisely what this family requires, given the current uncertainty surrounding your father's will." "Perhaps what this family requires," Evangeline said, her own voice rising with an assertiveness she had rarely allowed herself before, "is honesty regarding my father's true wishes, rather than a hasty marriage designed to circumvent whatever legal protections he originally intended for my benefit." Constance's face contorted with fury, and for a moment, Evangeline feared another physical outburst, similar to the garden party incident, though her stepmother seemed to catch herself just in time, perhaps remembering the considerable consequences that had followed her previous loss of control. "You will regret this defiance, Evangeline, I promise you that." "I regret many things about my life within this household," Evangeline said quietly, "but I do not regret refusing to marry a man I barely know, simply to serve your own convenience." She turned and left the drawing room before her stepmother could respond further, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fierce satisfaction at having finally spoken openly, however briefly, about the truth of her circumstances. As she climbed the stairs toward her room, she encountered Beatrice, waiting at the top, her expression anxious. "I heard raised voices," Beatrice said quietly. "Are you well?" "I am well," Evangeline said, though her voice trembled slightly with the aftermath of the confrontation. "I refused Lord Pemberton's consideration, Beatrice. I could not bring myself to enter such an arrangement, not while so much remains uncertain, and not with a man who spoke of my potential inheritance as simply another household asset to be claimed." Beatrice's expression softened with sympathy. "I do not blame you, Evangeline. I have long suspected Mother's true purpose in arranging that visit, and I confess, I am relieved you found the courage to refuse." That evening, Evangeline composed another letter to the Duke, detailing the day's events and her refusal of Lord Pemberton's implicit proposal. She felt considerable relief in having avoided the immediate danger Beatrice had warned her of, though she understood that Constance's fury at this refusal likely meant further schemes still lay ahead, further attempts to secure whatever advantage she could before the legal inquiry into the will's validity reached its final conclusion. As she sealed the letter and prepared once again to seek Peter's assistance in its delivery, she felt a quiet, steady resolve settling over her, considerably different from the anxious uncertainty that had governed so much of her life within this household. Whatever schemes Constance still harbored, whatever challenges remained ahead in the coming weeks, Evangeline understood now that she possessed a voice, and the courage to use it, in ways she had never previously believed possible. The formal hearing into the validity of Lord Ashworth's will took place nearly a month later, held before a county magistrate in a modest but dignified chamber attached to the local courthouse. Evangeline had spent the intervening weeks in a state of careful preparation, meeting several times with Mr. Grayson to review her testimony, gathering what additional evidence could be found among her father's old papers, and drawing further support from tenant families who had long suspected irregularities in the estate's management since her father's passing. She arrived that morning accompanied by Beatrice, who had quietly but firmly informed her mother that she intended to support Evangeline throughout the proceedings, regardless of any objection Constance might raise. Charlotte, notably, remained absent, having retreated into an uncomfortable neutrality that avoided taking any clear position on the matter, though Evangeline harbored no particular resentment toward her for this caution, understanding the difficult position her stepsister occupied between loyalty to her mother and an increasingly evident awareness of the truth. The chamber filled slowly with interested parties, several tenant families who had traveled considerable distances to offer testimony, along with a scattering of curious county residents who had heard whispers of the impending scandal and could not resist witnessing its resolution firsthand. Constance arrived separately, accompanied by Mr. Whitfield, her expression carrying a brittle composure that Evangeline recognized as the thin veneer covering considerable inner turmoil. The Duke arrived shortly before proceedings began, taking a seat near the front of the chamber alongside Mr. Grayson, and as their eyes met briefly across the room, Evangeline felt a steadying warmth settle over her anxious thoughts. Whatever the day's outcome, she understood she did not face it entirely alone. The magistrate, an elderly man with a reputation for careful, deliberate judgment, called the proceedings to order with practiced formality, outlining the matter under consideration, the circumstances surrounding amendments made to Lord Ashworth's will during his final illness, and the question of whether those amendments reflected his genuine and freely given wishes. Mr. Whitfield testified first, his account considerably more forthcoming than his earlier defensive posture had suggested, describing in careful detail the circumstances under which Constance had presented the amended language for his review, the brief and uncomfortable visit during which he had obtained Lord Ashworth's signature, and his own long-harbored reservations regarding the propriety of the entire process. Did Lord Ashworth appear to fully understand the nature of the document he signed? The magistrate asked directly. "I cannot say with certainty, sir," Mr. Whitfield admitted. His condition had grown considerably weaker by that point, and our exchange was brief, given his evident discomfort. I obtained his signature, but I did not witness any extended discussion of the document's specific terms. Several tenant families testified next, describing the gradual changes to their arrangements following Lord Ashworth's passing, reductions in their traditional shares of harvest, alterations to long-standing agreements regarding their use of certain lands, changes that several witnesses stated directly contradicted assurances Lord Ashworth had personally given them regarding the permanence of their arrangements before his death. Evangeline herself testified last, describing her memories of her father's original intentions, the letter she had discovered in the library, detailing his wishes for her independent inheritance, and Beatrice's overheard conversation regarding altered documents and concealed papers. Her voice remained steady throughout, years of quiet suffering finding their voice at last in careful, measured testimony that carried considerable weight throughout the hushed chamber. When Constance's turn came to offer her own account, she attempted to maintain her earlier defense, insisting that the amendments reflected her husband's genuine wishes, that she had acted only to protect the family's overall stability, rather than to enrich herself at her stepdaughter's expense. But her testimony faltered increasingly under the magistrate's careful questioning, particularly when pressed to explain why the amended will happened to concentrate greater control over estate finances directly under her own authority, rather than distributing benefits equally among all three daughters, as she claimed had been her husband's true intention. "Lady Constance," the magistrate said finally, his tone carrying the weight of a man who had heard enough to form a clear judgment, "the evidence presented today suggests a pattern of deliberate manipulation during a period when Lord Ashworth's capacity to fully understand or resist such changes was significantly compromised. I find myself unable to accept the amended will as a valid reflection of his true and freely given wishes." Constance's face drained of color entirely as the magistrate continued, outlining his decision to restore the original terms of Lord Ashworth's will, as best could be reconstructed, through the surviving correspondence and witness testimony, terms that established Evangeline's independent inheritance, restored the tenant family's original protections, and significantly reduced Constance's continued authority over the estate's ongoing management. Furthermore, the magistrate added, given the deliberate nature of these amendments, made during a period of evident vulnerability on Lord Ashworth's part, I believe further inquiry may be warranted regarding whether more serious legal consequences should apply to Lady Constance's conduct in this matter. A murmur swept through the assembled chamber at this pronouncement, and Evangeline watched her stepmother's composure finally collapse entirely, her earlier icy control replaced by something closer to genuine panic, as the full weight of the magistrate's judgment settled over her. Whatever social standing Constance had spent years carefully cultivating now stood in ruins, the truth of her manipulations exposed before the very community whose good opinion she had valued above all else. Following the hearing's conclusion, Evangeline found herself surrounded by well-wishers, tenant families, expressing gratitude for the restoration of their traditional protections, county neighbors, offering their support, now that the truth had finally emerged. The Duke made his way through the crowd toward her, his expression carrying warm relief, mixed with evident pride. "You handled yourself with remarkable grace and courage today," he said quietly, once they had found a moment of relative privacy near the chamber's entrance. "I could not have reached this point without your support," Evangeline replied. "You believed in the truth of my circumstances, when I had almost forgotten how to hope for justice at all. I believe," the Duke said carefully, "that you possessed the strength to seek this justice yourself, long before I ever involved myself in your circumstances. I simply provided the means by which that strength could finally find proper expression." As they spoke, Constance emerged from the chamber, her face pale and drawn, accompanied by Mr. Whitfield's uncomfortable presence, as he attempted to offer whatever remaining counsel he could regarding the practical implications of the magistrate's judgment. She did not approach Evangeline, instead moving quickly toward her waiting carriage, her earlier proud bearing replaced by something considerably diminished, a woman whose careful schemes had finally collapsed entirely beneath the weight of their own deception. Beatrice approached Evangeline shortly after, her expression carrying both relief and a lingering sadness regarding her mother's evident downfall. "I do not know what becomes of our family now," she said quietly, "though I confess, I feel considerable relief that the truth has finally emerged, whatever consequences follow from it." "You will always have a place in my regard, Beatrice," Evangeline said warmly, embracing her stepsister with genuine affection. "Whatever becomes of your mother's circumstances, I do not hold you responsible for her choices." As the crowd gradually dispersed and the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, Evangeline found herself walking alongside the Duke toward his waiting carriage, her heart considerably lighter than it had been in longer than she could remember. The truth of her father's wishes had finally been restored, the tenant family's protections secured once more, and whatever uncertain future lay ahead now felt considerably more promising than the diminished existence she had endured for so many years within her stepmother's careful control. "What will you do now?" the Duke asked as they walked, his tone carrying a careful curiosity that suggested considerable personal interest in her answer. "I believe," Evangeline said thoughtfully, "I shall need some time to properly understand my new circumstances, to determine how best to manage the estate's affairs going forward, and to consider what role, if any, remains for my stepmother and stepsisters within a household that has undergone such significant change." "A wise and measured approach," the Duke agreed, "though I hope you will allow me to remain involved in whatever comes next, not merely as a legal ally, but as someone who has come to hold you in the deepest possible regard." Evangeline felt her cheeks warm at these words, spoken with such quiet sincerity, beneath the formal courtesy of his usual manner. "I would welcome your continued presence in my life most warmly, Your Grace," she said softly, "in whatever capacity you believe most fitting." As his carriage finally departed that evening, carrying him back toward Foxmere, while Evangeline returned to the estate that was now, for the first time since her father's passing, truly and rightfully her own, she felt a profound sense of peace settling over her, the culmination of months of quiet courage, finally yielding the justice she had scarcely dared hope to find. Autumn had settled fully over the Ashworth estate by the time the last of the legal formalities concluded. The orchards her father had so carefully planted, now heavy with fruit ready for harvest. The tenant families moving through the fields with a renewed sense of security that had been absent for years. Evangeline stood at the edge of the eastern orchard one crisp morning, watching the workers gather the season's bounty, feeling a deep contentment she had rarely experienced within these grounds before. The months since the hearing had brought considerable change to the household. Constance, faced with the magistrate's judgment and the county's collective disapproval, had ultimately chosen to remove herself to a smaller property some distance away, a modest inheritance from her own family that had remained untouched by the scandals surrounding Lord Ashworth's will. She had departed with little ceremony, her once proud bearing considerably diminished, though Evangeline felt no particular satisfaction in her stepmother's downfall, only a quiet relief that the years of manipulation had finally come to their proper conclusion. Charlotte had accompanied her mother, choosing loyalty to family over the considerably more complicated path of remaining within a household so thoroughly transformed by recent events. Their parting had been civil, if somewhat strained, though Evangeline had made clear that her door remained open, should Charlotte ever wish to reconnect once time had softened the sharper edges of recent events. Beatrice, however, had chosen to remain, her genuine affection for Evangeline proving stronger than whatever loyalty she felt toward her mother's diminished circumstances. The two had grown considerably closer in the months since the hearing, their relationship deepening into something resembling true sisterhood, built now on honesty rather than the careful pretense that had governed their earlier interactions. The estate itself had flourished under Evangeline's careful stewardship, guided by the wisdom contained within her father's original correspondence, and supported by Mr. Grayson's continued legal counsel. The tenant families had responded with evident gratitude to the restoration of their traditional protections, working the land with renewed dedication that had already begun yielding considerably improved harvests compared to recent years. And through it all, the Duke's presence had remained a steady, welcome constant in her life, his visits growing more frequent as autumn deepened, their conversations evolving from careful legal discussions into something considerably warmer and more personal. Evangeline had come to treasure these visits deeply, finding in his company both the intellectual companionship she had long craved and a growing affection that continued to surprise her with its depth and steadiness. It was on just such a visit, as they walked together through the very orchard where her father had once planted these very trees with his own hands, that the Duke finally paused, turning to face her with an expression carrying more evident nervousness than she had ever witnessed in him before. "Lady Evangeline," he began, his voice carrying a formality that seemed almost quaint, given the easy familiarity that had developed between them over recent months. "I find myself in the somewhat unusual position of a man who has spent considerable time considering how best to express feelings that have grown, if I am honest, considerably beyond what might be expected between mere allies in a legal matter." Evangeline felt her heart quicken, understanding intuitively where this careful preamble seemed to be leading. "I confess my own feelings have followed a similar path these past months, Your Grace. I have come to hold you in the deepest possible regard," the Duke continued, his usual composed manner giving way to something more openly earnest. "Not merely for your courage in seeking justice for your father's true wishes, though that courage remains considerable, but for your gentle wisdom, your quiet strength, and the genuine warmth of character you have displayed throughout even the most difficult of circumstances." "Your Grace," Evangeline said softly, "you have shown me a kindness and support I scarcely believed myself deserving of, particularly during those first difficult weeks, when I understood so little of my own worth, beyond what my stepmother had taught me to believe. You deserved far better than what you received within that household," the Duke said firmly, "and I would consider it the greatest honor of my life if you would allow me to spend whatever years remain to us, ensuring you never again doubt your own worth, or lack for genuine care and support." He reached for her hand then, and Evangeline felt none of the fear or uncertainty that had once accompanied any unexpected touch, only a warm, steady comfort that had become entirely familiar over these recent months of growing acquaintance. "Lady Evangeline," he said, his voice carrying a quiet sincerity that touched her deeply, "would you do me the considerable honor of becoming my wife?" Evangeline felt tears rising unexpectedly to her eyes, though they carried none of the sorrow that had once accompanied so much of her life within this household. "Yes," she said softly, her voice steady, despite the emotion coursing through her. "Yes, Your Grace. I would be honored beyond measure to accept." The Duke's careful composure finally broke entirely into open, evident joy, and he raised her hand to his lips with a tenderness that spoke volumes beyond any formal words of courtship. "You have made me the happiest man in the county, Lady Evangeline, and I promise you every measure of respect, devotion, and genuine partnership for whatever years lie ahead of us." They walked together back toward the house, as the afternoon light softened into evening, discussing plans for their future, with an easy comfort that spoke to the genuine foundation their relationship had built over these recent months, far removed from the transactional coldness that had characterized Lord Pemberton's earlier consideration of marriage. Beatrice met them at the door, her face lighting with genuine delight as she quickly discerned the happy news written plainly across her stepsister's joyful expression. "I could not be happier for you both," she said warmly, embracing Evangeline with evident affection. "You deserve every happiness life has to offer, Evangeline, after everything you have endured these past months." The wedding took place the following spring, a considerably more modest affair than society might have expected, for the union of a duke, held in the same garden where fate had first brought them together, beneath such difficult circumstances. Evangeline stood beneath an archway of her father's own roses, considerably matured now from careful tending throughout the winter months, and felt his presence somehow woven into the very fabric of the celebration, as though he had somehow known, even in his final weakened days, that his daughter's true happiness still awaited her beyond the darkness of those difficult years. Beatrice stood beside her as her closest attendant, their sisterly bond now unshakable, built as it was on genuine loyalty rather than the careful pretense their earlier family arrangement had demanded. The tenant families attended in considerable numbers, their gratitude for the restoration of their protections translating into genuine warmth and celebration for the young woman who had fought so quietly but so determinedly on their behalf. As Evangeline exchanged her vows with the Duke, surrounded by genuine friends and loved ones rather than the careful social calculations that had governed so much of her previous existence, she felt a profound sense of completion settling over her, the culmination of a journey that had begun with a single, shocking moment of cruelty before an entire assembled party, and had ended in a love built on genuine respect, shared values, and steadfast mutual devotion. The orchards bloomed magnificently that spring, her father's careful planting finally yielding their fullest, most beautiful expression, as though the estate itself celebrated alongside its newly restored mistress the arrival of justice long delayed and happiness long deserved. Evangeline Ashworth, now Duchess of Foxmere, looked toward her future with a quiet confidence she had never believed herself capable of possessing, secure at last in the knowledge that her own worth and her own voice would never again be silenced or diminished by those who sought to profit from her suffering. The garden party that had once brought such public humiliation had, in the end, become the very foundation upon which her greatest happiness had been built, proof that even the darkest moments sometimes carry within them the seeds of a far brighter future, waiting patiently for the courage and support necessary to help them finally bloom.